Alice Warren arrived in the small industrial town of Millbrook on a cold Tuesday morning. She was a nurse, 32 years old, and she had taken the job at the local clinic to escape a past she did not like to discuss. The town was isolated, surrounded by gray hills and an old factory that had closed years ago. Most people who could leave had already done so, but those who remained were quiet, hardworking, and suspicious of strangers. Alice did not mind the suspicion, for she was not looking for friends but for silence. However, silence, she would soon learn, is never empty. Her first week at the clinic was uneventful. She treated minor cuts, colds, and a child with a fever. The clinic was small, with only one doctor who visited twice a week. For the rest of the time, Alice was alone. She lived in a small rented room above a closed bakery. The landlord was an old woman named Mrs. Hill, who spoke only when necessary and never smiled. Alice found this refreshing, for she had spent years in a busy city hospital where everyone talked too much. Here, no one asked personal questions. On her 10th day in Millbrook, a man did not show up for his appointment. His name was Peter Cross. He was 55 years old, and he was a former factory worker who came to the clinic every 2 weeks for medication. Alice called the number she had on file, but no one answered. She asked Mrs. Hill if she knew Peter Cross, but Mrs. Hill said nothing and simply turned her back and walked away. That was the first sign. The second sign came 3 days later. A woman named Linda Ford did not pick up her daughter from the small-town school. The teacher, a nervous young man named Thomas, went to Linda's house and found the door unlocked, the lights on, and no one inside. The kettle was still warm. Thomas reported this to Victor Lowe, the owner of the town's only general store and the closest thing Millbrook had to a community leader. Victor Lowe was a tall man in his 60s, with gray hair and calm eyes. He listened to Thomas, nodded slowly, and seemed unconcerned, suggesting that Linda had probably gone to visit family. But Thomas remained worried. He mentioned the disappearance to Alice when she came to pick up medical supplies from the store. Alice noticed that Victor Lowe's eyes followed her as she left. That evening, Alice walked to Peter Cross's house. It was a small wooden building at the edge of town. The door was locked, and the windows were dark. She knocked on the neighbor's door, but no one answered. She could feel eyes watching her from behind curtains, but no one spoke. On her way back to the clinic, she found a folded piece of paper on the ground. It was not there before. She opened it. Handwritten in block letters was a short sentence in a foreign language. Alice did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning well enough. Those who know stay silent, and those who stay silent live. She kept the paper in her pocket. The next morning, a third person disappeared. His name was Mark Benson, a mechanic who worked alone in a small garage on the main road. He was last seen closing his shop at 7 in the evening. By morning, the garage was locked, his tools were in place, and he was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, and no car tracks leaving in a hurry, just absence. Alice went to Victor Lowe's store and asked him directly about the 3 disappearances. Victor leaned on the counter and looked at her for a long moment. He suggested she focus on her patients and leave the town's affairs to those who understood it better. His voice was calm and gentle, but his eyes were hard. Alice said nothing, bought a loaf of bread, and left. But she did not let it go. That night, she wrote down everything she knew: Peter Cross, Linda Ford, and Mark Benson, 3 different ages, 3 different jobs, and 3 different parts of town. The only connection she could find was a place called the Rusty Nail, a small bar on the south side of Millbrook. Each of the 3 had been seen there on the night before they disappeared. She had heard this from Thomas, the teacher, who had heard it from a student's parent. It was not solid evidence, but it was something. Alice decided to visit the Rusty Nail. The bar was dark inside, with wooden floors that creaked and a ceiling fan that moved too slowly. The bartender was a heavy man named Frank, who did not smile. There were 3 customers, all men, all drinking in silence. Alice ordered coffee, but Frank said they did not serve coffee. she ordered water instead, and Frank gave her a glass and watched her drink it. She asked if he knew Peter Cross. Frank's hand stopped wiping the counter for half a second, then he continued, saying that Peter Cross did not come there anymore. When Alice asked why, Frank said it was because Peter had left, like people do. Alice finished her water and left. Outside, the street was empty. The streetlights in Millbrook were old and weak, casting small circles of yellow light on the dark pavement. She walked home quickly, feeling the weight of unseen eyes again. The next day, she decided to visit Samuel Hill. Samuel Hill was the old man who lived behind the church. He was Mrs. Hill's husband, but they had not spoken in years, and no one knew why. Samuel was 74 years old, with a white beard and hands that shook slightly. He spent most of his day sitting on a wooden chair by his back door, watching the alley that ran behind the church. He never went to the store and never went to the clinic, he just watched. Alice brought him a warm meal from the clinic's small kitchen. She knocked on his door and waited. After a long minute, the door opened a crack, and Samuel's tired eyes looked at her. Alice explained who she was and that she had brought food. Samuel opened the door wider but did not smile, taking the food and nodding. Alice did not leave immediately. She stood there and, after a moment, mentioned the 3 missing people and asked if Samuel knew anything about them. Samuel looked at the food in his hands, then at Alice. His mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to speak, but then he closed it. He shook his head slowly and stepped back inside. The door closed, and Alice heard the lock turn. But she did not give up. She returned the next day and the day after that, each time bringing food or warm clothes. Each time, she asked no questions at first. She simply sat on the steps outside his door and talked about small things like the weather, the clinic, or a bird she had seen. On the 4th visit, Samuel Hill opened his door and sat on the steps next to her. He did not speak for a long time. Then, in a voice rough from years of silence, he warned her that she should leave this town while she still could. Alice asked why. Samuel looked at the church wall across the alley and explained that the ones who stay disappear, and the ones who ask questions disappear faster. Alice felt a cold hand grip her chest, but she did not look away. She told Samuel she was not leaving until she knew the truth, adding that he could help her or watch her become the 4th name on the list. Samuel closed his eyes, his hands trembling more than usual. For a full minute, he said nothing. Then he stood up slowly and walked back inside, but this time, he left the door open. Alice followed him in. Samuel Hill's small room was dark and smelled of old wood and medicine. There was a single bed, a table with a lamp, and a window that faced the alley. On the wall, there was a calendar from 10 years ago. Samuel sat on the edge of his bed and motioned for Alice to sit on a wooden chair. She sat. The old man took a long breath before he began to speak, explaining that Millbrook was not always like that. 15 years ago, the factory was open, people worked, and people talked. There were parties and children playing in the street. Then the factory closed, most people left, and those who stayed had nothing left but silence. Alice listened carefully without interrupting. Samuel continued, saying that Victor Lowe arrived 8 years ago. He bought the general store, started giving people food when they had no money, and paid for repairs on houses. He became the person everyone trusted, but Samuel warned that Victor Lowe was not a good man. He was a collector. Alice frowned, and Samuel clarified, a collector of debts, favors, and people who owed him something that could never be paid back. When Victor Lowe gave you something, you belonged to him, and if you tried to leave or talk about what you had seen, you did not simply disappear, but you were made to disappear. Alice leaned forward and asked what Samuel had seen. The old man shook his head, saying it was not what he had seen but what he had heard. From his window at night, he heard cars arriving at the old factory after midnight, doors opening and closing, and voices that were not raised in anger but in command, then silence. The next morning, someone was gone, always someone who owed Victor money or someone who talked too much. Alice remembered the 3 missing people and asked if Peter Cross owed Victor money. Samuel nodded, explaining that Peter had lost his job and borrowed from Victor to pay his rent but could not pay back. 1 week before he disappeared, Samuel heard Peter shouting at Victor in the alley. Peter said he would go to the police in the city, but Victor laughed and said there were no police there, only him. 3 nights later, Peter was gone. Alice felt her heart beating faster and asked about Linda Ford. Samuel closed his eyes, saying that Linda was worse because she saw something she should not have seen. She worked as a cleaner at Victor's store after hours. One night, she was there when Victor received visitors, men from outside in dark cars. They talked about money and transport and things that were not legal. Linda hid in the back room and listened. The next day, she told her sister, and her sister told a friend. Within a week, everyone knew that Victor Lowe was not just a store owner but a smuggler who moved goods through the old factory at night. No one knew what goods, and no one wanted to know. Alice's mind raced, and she asked about Mark Benson. Samuel opened his eyes, saying that Mark was the mechanic and Victor used his garage to store things. Mark did not ask questions for 2 years. Then one day, Mark found something in a truck he was repairing, something that scared him. He told his brother he was going to leave town the next morning, but he never made it to the morning. Alice stood up, feeling anger burning in her chest. She asked why no one did anything and why everyone just stayed silent. Samuel looked at her with old, tired eyes and explained that Victor Lowe did not kill people because he did not need to, he simply made them leave. If you had nowhere else to go and no money to leave with, you learned to keep your mouth shut, look the other way, and forget. Alice paced the small room, insisting that there must be evidence proving what Victor was doing, but Samuel shook his head, saying that Victor burned everything, kept no paper, used no phones, and spoke only in person and only in whispers. The men who came to see him came at night and left before dawn, never using the same car twice. Victor was not a foolish man but a careful one, and that was why he had survived so long. Alice stopped pacing and asked how they could stop him. Samuel laughed a sad, bitter laugh, saying that they did not stop him but left instead. That was what he tried to do 5 years ago. He packed a bag and walked to the bus stop at 4 in the morning, but Victor was waiting for him. Victor did not threaten or touch him. He simply pointed out that Samuel's wife was old and could not take care of herself, asking who would watch her and bring her food if Samuel left, and telling him to think carefully before taking that bus. Samuel's voice cracked as he said he turned around, went back home, and had not left his room since that day, because Victor Lowe did not need to hurt you, he just needed you to know that he could, and that was worse. Alice sat back down, finally understanding why the town was so quiet. It was not peace but fear, fear so deep and so old that it had become part of the air. She looked at Samuel and said she was not leaving, but she needed his help just to watch and tell her when he saw something unusual. Samuel hesitated for a long time, then nodded once. For the next week, Alice continued her work at the clinic during the day. At night, she sat by Samuel's window, watching the alley and the road that led to the old factory. Nothing happened for 6 nights. On the 7th night, she saw headlights. A black car with no visible license plate drove slowly past the church and turned toward the factory. Samuel whispered that one of them had arrived and that Victor would be there within the hour. Alice made a decision. She put on a dark coat and left Samuel's room, walking through the alley while staying close to the walls and moving as quietly as she could. The night was cold and moonless. The old factory stood like a dark skeleton against the sky. She found a broken window at the back and climbed inside. The air smelled of rust and oil. She heard voices ahead, echoing in the large empty space, and moved closer, hiding behind old machinery. Victor Lowe was there, standing with 2 men she had never seen. They were looking at a truck parked in the center of the factory floor. The back of the truck was open, and inside were many boxes. Victor spoke in a low voice about a shipment leaving at midnight, instructing the men to take the back roads with no lights and no stops. One of the men mentioned the nurse, and Victor smiled. He said that Miss Warren was curious, which was dangerous in Millbrook, but he would handle her because she was new and would learn. The men nodded, closed the truck, and got inside. The engine started. Victor walked toward the front of the factory, and Alice knew she had only seconds to escape. She turned to leave, but her foot hit a loose piece of metal. The sound echoed through the factory like a gunshot. Victor stopped and turned his head slowly, calling out into the darkness to ask who was there. Silence fell, and Alice did not breathe. Victor walked toward the machinery where she was hiding, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He was not in a hurry, for he knew there was nowhere to run. Alice pressed herself against the cold metal wall. Victor was 10 feet away, then 5 feet, then 3. He reached the edge of the machine where Alice was hiding and looked directly at her. Their eyes met. Victor low smiled and said good evening to Miss Warren, mentioning that he was hoping they would talk soon. Alice did not run, for she knew that running would only confirm her fear, and she refused to give Victor Lowe that satisfaction. She stood up slowly, brushing the dust from her coat, and looked directly into his calm gray eyes. She returned his greeting in a steady voice, even though her heart was pounding. Victor tilted his head slightly, as if examining a strange insect, and remarked that she was very brave or very foolish. He had not decided which. Alice did not answer. Victor continued, saying that she had been asking questions, visiting old Samuel, and walking around at night. People in Millbrook did not do these things, and there was a reason for that. Alice said the reason was fear, but Victor smiled again and called it respect. He explained that he had given this town food, supplies, and medicine when the clinic had none, and he had kept the store open when no one else would. In return, he asked only for discretion, for people there understood that some things were not their business. Alice pointed out that 3 people were missing and that was everyone's business. Victor's smile faded as he claimed that Peter Cross owed him money he could not pay and chose to leave rather than face his debt, that Linda Ford was a gossip who spread lies about him and chose to leave rather than apologize, and that Mark Benson was involved in illegal activities with people from outside and chose to leave rather than face the consequences. Victor insisted he did not make them leave but simply did not stop them. Alice shook her head, saying that Victor had threatened them and made them afraid to stay. Victor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. He explained that there were places where the law did not reach, where the police did not come, and where a man must protect what was his or lose everything. He said Millbrook was such a place. He was not a criminal but a necessity, for without him the town would be empty, and without him there would be no store, no clinic, and no food. He claimed he had built what remained of Millbrook with his own hands and would not let a stranger destroy it because of a few missing people who were never coming back anyway. Alice felt her fear turning into determination. She said she was not leaving and not staying silent, for she had seen the truck and the boxes, and she would go to the city police and tell them everything. Victor laughed quietly, asking if she thought the city police cared about Millbrook. He said they would not drive 2 hours on a dirt road because a nurse said she saw boxes in a factory. He pointed out that she had no evidence, no names, no dates, just a story and nothing more. He was right, and Alice knew it. She had no proof, no photographs, no recordings, just her own eyes and ears. Victor saw the realization on her face, and his smile returned. He told her what would happen. She would go back to her room, sleep, and continue her work at the clinic tomorrow. She would speak to no one about what she had seen, and in 1 week she would leave Millbrook, telling everyone she found a better job, and she would never return. He called the offer generous and warned her not to refuse it. Alice looked at him for a long moment, then asked what would happen if she refused. Victor's eyes turned cold as he said she would become the 4th person who chose to leave in the night, and no one would ask questions because in Millbrook no one asked questions, and she had seen that for herself. He turned his back to her and walked toward the front of the factory, giving her until the next night to choose wisely. He disappeared through a door, and the factory fell silent. Alice stood alone in the darkness, her hands shaking, She waited until she was sure Victor was gone, then climbed back through the broken window and walked home, unable to sleep that night. The next morning, Alice went to the clinic as usual. She treated 2 patients, cleaned the instruments, and organized the supplies, but her mind was working constantly. She knew she could not stay in Millbrook, for Victor would make sure of that, but she also knew she could not leave without doing something. She thought about Samuel Hill, trapped in his room for 5 years. She thought about the missing 3, who had no one to speak for them, and she thought about the town, slowly dying in silence. Then she made a decision. That afternoon, Alice walked to Victor Lowe's store. He was behind the counter, arranging cans of food. He looked up when she entered and smiled, asking if she had made her decision. Alice nodded, saying she had decided to leave. Victor's smile widened as he called it a wise choice and asked when she would go. Alice said she would go that night, packing her things and taking the bus at midnight. Victor nodded approvingly, saying he was glad she was being reasonable and that it would have been a shame if something had happened to her. He added that she was a good nurse and that Millbrook would miss her. Alice turned to leave but then stopped and looked back at him. She said she had written a letter that morning and given it to Thomas, the teacher. The letter was sealed and contained everything she had seen and heard since she arrived in Millbrook. If she did not arrive safely at the city bus station the next morning, Thomas would open the letter and send it to every newspaper and every police department in the region. She had also told Samuel Hill the same thing. He might not leave his room, but he had a window and eyes, and if she disappeared, the silence in Millbrook would be broken forever. For the first time since Alice had met him, Victor Lowe's smile disappeared completely. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and he said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then, in a low and dangerous voice, he said she was playing a dangerous game, but Alice replied that she was ending a dangerous game, and the silence ended that night, one way or another. She walked out of the store without looking back. That night, Alice packed her bag and said goodbye to Mrs. Hill, who said nothing but nodded once. She walked to Samuel Hill's door and knocked, and he opened it slowly. Alice said she was leaving but would not disappear, for she would be at the bus station by 6 in the morning. If she was not, Samuel knew what to do. Samuel looked at her with something that might have been respect, calling her a strange woman who came for silence and was leaving with a war. Alice smiled and said that sometimes silence was the enemy and sometimes the only way to win was to make noise. She walked to the bus stop at the edge of town, a small bench with a broken sign. The bus came only when someone called the company in the city, and Alice had called that morning. She sat on the bench in the cold dark, waiting. An hour passed, then another. At 5 in the morning, she saw headlights in the distance. The bus was coming. But before it arrived, she saw another set of headlights, a black car coming from the direction of the factory. It stopped 50 feet away from her, and the door opened. Victor Lowe stepped out and walked toward her slowly, his hands in his coat pockets. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her, saying she had caused him a great deal of trouble. He had spoken to Thomas, who was afraid and would not open the letter, and Samuel was old and weak, so no one would believe him. He said she had no allies there and was alone. Alice stood up and faced him, saying that maybe that was true, but she pointed out that he was standing there at 5 in the morning trying to stop her from leaving, which meant he was afraid too. He was afraid of what she knew and what she might do. She said he had controlled the town with fear for 8 years, but fear was a two-way street, and he was just as trapped there as everyone else. If he left, he lost everything. If he stayed, he lived every day wondering who might break the silence next. That was not power, she said, that was prison. Victor's face went pale, and he opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the bus arrived. Its headlights flooded the street, and the door opened with a hiss of air. Alice picked up her bag, looked at Victor Lowe one last time, and said goodbye, telling him to enjoy his silence. She stepped onto the bus, and the doors closed behind her. She sat by the window and watched Victor Lowe stand alone at the bus stop as the bus pulled away. He did not move or wave, just stood there as a small man in a gray coat under a broken sign in a dying town. Alice never returned to Millbrook, but 6 months later, she received a letter from Thomas, the teacher. He wrote that Victor Lowe had sold his store and left town without telling anyone. The old factory had been searched by the city police after an anonymous tip. The boxes were gone, but the tire tracks and the empty space were enough to open an investigation. No one was ever arrested. But the fear in Millbrook began to fade. People started talking again, children played in the street, and Samuel Hill was seen sitting outside his door, not just watching but greeting people who passed by. Thomas wrote that the silence was broken and that it took a stranger to break it, thanking Alice Warren. Alice folded the letter and put it in a drawer. She had found a new job in a new town. And this time, when people asked her where she came from, she told them the truth. She told them about Millbrook, about the silence, and about how one person who refuses to be afraid can change everything.